Hey, how's it going? My name is Strons, and today I want to do things kind of old school. I'm just going to talk for a while. I'm not going to have a lot of quick cuts or anything crazy like that, but just wanted to open up to a conversation of what your preference is. I really would like to know in the comments down below, specifically talking about focal length. A lot of times these days we see shooters of all shapes and sizes using wider focal lengths, and you see just as equally many people using longer focal lengths for their content. I think wide focal lengths became very popular in the YouTuber content creator space, but even years ago, I talked about this phenomenon with smartphones and people taking pictures of themselves. Selfies are usually taken with the front-facing camera. It usually tends to be a wider focal length on most smartphones, and getting that kind of wide field of view, that wider perspective, more distortion to the face, I think has changed a lot of the ways we view ourselves, we view other people. If you look back traditionally, portrait photography has always been done with longer focal lengths. It's more flattering, more pleasing, more compression, which maybe isn't true. Maybe compression is more of a myth, but it's not really, in that it's actually practically the way we use these lenses. There is more compression, even though technically there might not be. But you can think of it that way. When we use a longer focal length, we're gonna have a more compression, but there's a lot of people who don't like how their face looks at longer focal lengths because it makes them look fatter, you know, the camera adding 10 pounds. If you look at compression, it certainly does that to the face. It kind of bulks things up a little bit, whereas those wider focal lengths, especially close up, tend to distort and elongate, whether that's arms or noses or jaw lines, whatever it might be. So I'm really curious nowadays the way you're doing work, if you're using wider focal lengths intentionally for more portrait style work or content creator work, or if you're sticking with the tried and true classics of those longer focal lengths. Right now, you're looking at a wider focal length, 10 millimeters on a micro four thirds camera, the G9 Mark II. And you can see how wide a perspective that is compared to this camera, which is an FX6 with a 70 millimeter lens. And you can see what that looks like. I tend to prefer the longer focal length compared to the wider focal length. I think the wide is certainly a look and makes sense for the content creator, YouTuber, influencer landscape. And you can get some really cool wide angle shots, but there's something about those longer focal lengths that just speaks to me. For whatever reason, I've always preferred them, even getting wider shots. That's one thing I really like to do. I don't necessarily like to use a long lens for close-up work. I like to use a longer lens to get wide shots just with that longer focal length. And there is a difference. Sometimes we joke around about tight wides and loose longs, and for as silly as that sounds, it's kind of true. Getting close with a wide lens looks pretty cool. That tight wide, getting up close and personal, it looks more interesting. Whereas if you have a longer focal length, being a little bit looser with the framing and having that wider field of view can also be quite satisfying, and just some stuff you don't really see with your own human eyes. I think that's one of the most fun parts about cinematography, photography, whatever you're into, video, film, content creation, it doesn't really matter. I like showing perspectives that we don't quite always see with our human eyes. I think that's why drone shots and aerial photography are so popular, because it's just that bird's eye view that we don't get to see on the day-to-day basis, or even things like macro photography or a probe lens, or even things like Steadicam and slider shots. There's so many tricks and tools that we can use to create images that are a little bit surreal, a little bit unnatural, a little bit more than what you get in your kind of plain day-to-day perspective, you know, if you're just walking around. And that's why I tend to think those middle of the range focal lengths are less interesting. They're certainly valuable and they're very useful if you're doing any kind of street photography and you want a general purpose lens, something in that mid-range, you know, 24 to 70 on a full frame camera, something like that gives you a very natural point of view in terms of perspective and distortion and flexibility, because you can get wide shots, you can get close-ups, you can get details, you can do basically everything with a 24 to 70 or whatever your sensor equivalent might be. On micro four thirds, it'd be 12 to 35, APS-C. I can't do the math right now off the cuff, but there's plenty of focal lengths all shapes and sizes. They work for a variety of things, and there's no right or wrong. And that's why I really did want to ask you, what do you prefer? What is your preference? What do you use for different types of work? Do you find these days that clients are leaning one way or the other in terms of what they prefer and what they want to see? Do you tend to notice that if you're taking pictures of people that they prefer wider focal lengths because of that whole selfie phenomenon? I truly think that is the case. There's a lot of times where I'm taking pictures of people and they're so used to seeing themselves with that selfie camera that when I show them a shot with a longer lens, they go, wait a minute, what's going on here? I don't look quite right. This is unfamiliar to me. In the same way that a lot of people are so used to seeing themselves in a mirror when they're doing their hair, they're doing their makeup, they're getting ready in the morning, they're looking at a mirrored reflection, an inverse of themselves. You show them a photo and they get a little shocked there for a second maybe. These days that's less common because people are getting their picture taken so often with social media, but that certainly used to be the case where people are used to looking at their reflection and then you show them what the rest of the world sees and they're taken aback for a moment saying, that's not me, that's a bizarro version of me, what's wrong with my face? And even the opposite is true. You can get so used to seeing yourself in the regular perspective that even if you flip footage, oftentimes you'll see that in video production, you need to flip an angle for whatever reason, as long as there's no text, there's nothing discernible knowing left to right, you can't really tell. If you flip it, sometimes that can be a little uncanny too, and you don't quite know why is it what I'm looking at doesn't look quite right, doesn't really look like that individual actually looks. So I'm very curious what you're doing these days, whether it's video or photo, cinematography, content creation, doesn't really matter. I just am curious. I tend to prefer this type of look, that longer lens, but there's certainly a time and a place for the close-up with the wide-angle lens. It's very cool, it's very intimate, it's very close. It feels very real to me, where anything at a distance, it does have that little bit of separation where it doesn't feel quite as much like you're there in the moment. It's more you're sitting back and watching things take place. And I think that is true for me personally, the dynamics between watching something like reality television or a documentary versus a movie and what you would consider true cinema. There's always a distance, a separation with those longer lenses that are just further back and more away. It feels like you're watching maybe like a play, a theatrical production. You're at a distance where there's a lot of content these days, vlogs especially on YouTube, where you're very up close and very intimate because you have that wider lens. A lot of content creators like to shoot that way with those shallow depth of field lenses, those low apertures, but still having that wide angle. It can be quite cool and quite interesting to look at, a little bit of a newer phenomenon maybe years ago, and maybe it's lost its luster a little bit. So really just let me know what you're doing and why, because I think that's always the key to behind any choice is why did you do what you did, and how can that help other people maybe not make some mistakes and maybe find success in other ways. It's always subjective. Art, creativity, there's a lot of opinions, there's always a lot of cooks in the kitchen, or there can be on certain projects. But I like that in this kind of space where we can work together and talk about, well, what have you found success with? What do you see people preferring? What do you personally prefer? Does that work? Are people willing to pay more for that? There's so many things nowadays. These smartphones have 3, 4, 5 different lenses on them sometimes, and people have their preference of what they pick, whether they're making a TikTok, an Instagram, or something like that. There's flexibility now. People know what those ultra wides look like. They know what a normal lens looks like. They know what a telephoto lens looks like. And I think that's been the biggest change I've seen, is putting those cameras in people's pockets and letting them have access to it every single day. It just changes the dynamics of how we work with other people, especially when it comes to photography, but also with video and any kind of content production. There's so much out there as far as what people are consuming. I think there's something like 35 million TikToks uploaded every single day. It's an absurd amount of content, and that's just on TikTok. Imagine Instagram, imagine YouTube, imagine Facebook, and all the other places. People are constantly bombarded with content, both at a professional level, at a prosumer level, and then at an independent amateur level, where it's just regular people taking pictures of themselves, of each other, of their pets, of landscapes. And what stands out? Certainly there's tricks you can do, like editing and color grading and all the post-processing that really adds a lot to your images and to your footage. I think that makes a big difference in terms of how it stands out. But at the same time, people have Instagram filters and there's all sorts of stuff you can do to process images on a smartphone. So the fact that these tools and tricks are accessible to so many people individually, I think it's interesting to find out, okay, well, what helps differentiate or separate the professional in terms of the look, in terms of the aesthetic? When you're scrolling through a sea of 35 million pieces of content every single day, what's gonna help you stand out? What's gonna get you noticed? What's gonna look the best, feel the best? Because again, it's subjective, it changes over time. You look back into the portraits from the 70s or 80s and how different they are compared to the 2000s and then compared to today. What's working, what's trending, the color palettes that people prefer, the type of imagery people prefer. Do you want it really posed and intentional and very obvious that you're taking a photo, or do you want it more candid and natural and more playful? There's even been debates now about having the perfect settings. What used to be considered perfect for photography is now, Dutch angles and crooked horizons and blurry, smeary shutters and out of focus. All the wrong things are now right and cool and stylish, or at least they can be. So again, really just let me know what you think and what you do and what you prefer, because I think I would actually learn a lot from that, because we all live in our own little bubble. We all do our own kind of work. And for me, it's the longer focal lengths for this type of interview style setup. I don't want to be super close. I don't want to be super tight. Just give it a little bit of room, a little looseness, give it some room to breathe, but still have that longer focal length. I think it looks quite nice, but there's certainly a time and a place for those wide angle lenses as well. Those shorter focal lengths can be quite satisfying to look at just because they are so unique and interesting. And back in the day, it was fisheye was the close-up, wide angle look, but now we have these rectilinear lenses that are ultra, ultra wide. And they do have some distortion, it's there, you can see, but it's not the bulby fisheye look that it used to be back in the past when, that's what wide angle photography or video looked like. So let me know what your thoughts are. I'd really be curious to hear what you have to say, what you prefer, what you see working, and we can all kind of join in. I think that's a fun experiment to see what everyone's doing these days.